Our next speaker, ladies and gentlemen, is Professor Lewis Nelson. And Lewis, where are you? Thank you. I rather undersold you earlier when I described your talk as introductory. In one sense, I think it's going to be exactly that, in that you're going to provide us, in a way, with a framework and a context within which to approach our more focused theme. But that's immensely important, and it's for that reason that we've designated yours the keynote talk of the day. Lewis is Professor of Architectural History at the University of Virginia. He's a specialist in early modern Atlantic world, and he's produced works on the Caribbean, West Africa, and the American South. His most recent monograph, Architecture and Empire in Jamaica, has won multiple awards. Lewis is going to talk to us on a fascinating subject, not directly about silver, but very directly about Robert, and about history, and how it can be forgotten, even when remaining in plain sight. It's one, I feel, that we won't find it difficult to apply to our own subject. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Lewis Nelson.
So in the spring of 2012, I received an extraordinary gift, the gift of an email. I was on sabbatical leave on fellowship at Oxford, and some months prior, I agreed to give a paper for the Friends of the Georgian Society of Jamaica, now renamed Jamaican Heritage Renewal, on my current book project on the architecture of 18th century Jamaica. Having received notification of my talk, Robert Barker reached out. And in his usual gesture of intellectual generosity, he shared with me some of his knowledge on a central subject of my research, the 1745 Hay map of Kingston. His email, as you saw, was kind, clear, and generous, but I had no idea that this email would transform my research, not only on the map, but on so much of what I thought I knew, and what we thought we knew about 18th century Jamaican architecture. Now, I say this here because whilst most of you know him as a scholar and a collector of silver, I came to a deep respect for Robert as an extraordinary researcher of all things Jamaican. And to be fair, I only came to know about his interest in silver a couple years after we met. So we made arrangements to meet for dinner at his flat at Lauderdale the day before my lecture, and within minutes, I came to realize that in this friendship, Robert's email was a gift of gold. Or rather, silver. In that first meeting and in subsequent visits, I shared with him the most interesting dimensions of the work I'd begun on mid-18th century Jamaican elite. And in almost every instance, he already knew about the person, and was willing to share with me some thread of research on property maps, probate records, juicy tidbits from 18th century newspapers. During my various visits to Lauderdale that spring, we spent hours discussing the lives and architecture of the likes of Dawkins, Pinnock, and Blagrove. Curiosities like fortified watermills, and the house of Alexander McFarlane, seen here on that same map, a Kingston scientist and astronomer whose house appeared on that 1745 map. So now on the screen is the text from one of our innumerable exchanges a few years later, this one regarding the McFarlane residence you've just seen, which was surmounted with an astronomical observatory. Robert wished to better understand how unimpeded visual access to the horizon featured in McFarlane's selection of the house lot he chose in Kingston. Now, I'll give you just a moment to read through a sentence or two, simply to digest the intensity of this man's research prowess. Combining his own knowledge of the architecture of 18th century Kingston with an exacting assessment of contour maps, he is in this moment seeking to confirm McFarlane's unimpeded view of the horizon, a condition made possible only by his careful selection of a house lot prior to construction. Robert's astonishing commitment to accuracy is lightened only by occasional phrases like, "Apologies, but I'm not learned enough." He concluded the email with, "I hope all of this makes sense." 3 years on, Robert and I had begun a conversation about co-authoring a book on the architecture of mid-18th century Jamaica. Although, truth be told, this was really more my own attempt to get him to commit to paper some of this extraordinary knowledge about mid-18th century Jamaica. And in preparation for this lecture, I came to remember that Robert and I scheduled regular phone calls, and that typically a day before, he would send me an agenda for a phone call. I share one of these because they remind us of Robert's delightful intensity. 5 years into our friendship, I returned to London to deliver another lecture for friends, this time a survey of my forthcoming book entitled Architecture and Empire in Jamaica, a book that has Robert's fingerprints throughout. That evening, he sent me an email. That evening, he sent me an email that of all of his voluminous communications to me over the years, I prize this email the most. I made Robert proud. Now, my project today is to share with you one shared journey that was likely the most collaborative of our 7-year friendship, our partnership to better understand COLBECK Castle, which you see here. COLBECK lived large in the Jamaican imagination as a huge corner tower ruin that popular belief had assigned to the 17th century, or possibly even of Spanish construction, and a great house never finished. During one of my previous field school seasons on Jamaica, I'd taken several of my students to visit COLBECK, and I'd begun to doubt some of these popular myths. I shared my doubts with Robert, and having previously carried very little about this woman, Robert became intrigued, and together we began a journey that would build on some previous assessment of the building's surviving architectural fabric, but that would take our interpretation of the building to an entirely new level. Now, let's begin with an introduction to the building, as I encountered it in numerous field excavations, and then through an intensive documentation of the surviving ruins in partnership with Edward Chappell, also now deceased. To find COLBECK Castle, a visitor must have a keen sense of direction and just a bit of faith. The final road to the site is little more than a long dirt path, well removed from the major roads or highways in the south coast. Approaching the ruin, the visitor gets this clear sense that this is no ordinary British colonial house. The building is a south-facing, 2-story stone house with brick trim framed by 4 dramatic corner towers rising 3 stories each. Double arcades connect the towers with 5 arches each on long elevation, 3 on the short. Visually striking circular windows on the ground floor of the towers, absent only from their northern prospect, signal the south as the formal facade. The double arcades and COLBECK's 4 loggias are among the most striking of its architectural features, with no correspondence elsewhere in the Anglo-colonial world. Now, COLBECK's double arcades seem likely adapted from Italian architect Sebastiano Serlio's early 16th century treatise, first published in English in 1611. In that volume, Serlio publishes 2 versions of a famous 15th century country house outside of Naples, Poggio Reale. The first version of this, on the left, represents the building as Serlio found it, and the second is Serlio's adaptation of his own design from the original. You see both here. The original building is a perfect square with an open internal courtyard, and 4 corner towers connected by loggias on all 4 elevations. The Serlio adaptation on the right is like COLBECK, a rectangle with 2 longer prominent elevations and 2 shorter side elevations. The corner towers appear in both versions. As in Serlio's adaptation of the original, COLBECK boasts 5 bays between the towers on each of the longer elevations and 3 on the shore. Along with the designs of Poggio Reale, Serlio offered a written defense for the design based not only on its convenience as a modern villa, but also its capacity to manage the heat and the light of the sun, a selling point in both Italy and Jamaica. Quote, this building was intended for use during very hot periods. The hall of the 4 chambers would always be cool with the sun, unable to enter. End quote. Serlio then celebrated the power of architecture to ennoble. Naples is called noble not only for its exceedingly noble manners, Serlio would write, its race of barons and castellans and counts, its innumerable gentlemen and grand nobility. Buildings the noble manners and grace. Surely COLBECK's builder sought the same for himself. In all its essential features, COLBECK Castle in remote colonial Jamaica seemed dependent on the published designs of a celebrated 15th century Italian country villa and adaptations of that house by a famous 16th century Italian architect. But COLBECK is not just a house. It stands in the midst of a huge square terrace, positioned on a slight rise above the vast expanses of Santiago Plains in Jamaica, an open plain of more than 50,000 acres of rich alluvial flatlands in St. Dorothy's Parish, now folded into St. Catherine's. The main house of COLBECK, situated in the middle of a raised terrace, is framed by 4 corner buildings. The house and the corner buildings are connected via a very sophisticated water drainage system that channels water that would flood the site during Jamaica's heavy rainfalls through drains to spouts that pierce retaining walls that define the terrace in regular intervals. More than 10-foot height of the terrace wall in the southwest corner is a reminder of the extraordinary amount of earth moving that was required to create a flat, Renaissance-like house terrace from the originally uneven and rocky site. While plantation houses and English country houses often boast flankers, one smaller building to either side of the main, there is far less evidence in the English tradition of a fully raised terrace with 4 corner buildings. The closest parallel would have been Colonial, the great villa designed by Giuliano da Sangallo for the Medici family in the middle of the 16th century. If this is a visual reference, then the house looks to 2 very important Italian Renaissance villas. COLBECK is a rare survival of the island's grand country house building tradition. Entrance through the building's main southern arcade gave direct access into a spacious, fully paneled stair hall, with stairs rising to the landing dominated by a huge set of double doors. The dedication of the double-height stair hall was the first polite space, and the sequence of such spaces conveyed a recognition of the significance of grand and elegant staircases in English unique houses as an object of visual delight and a stage for the performance of dignity and grace. The double doors opened into a large, fully paneled hall, itself offering access to 2 of the main 4 arcades. These arcades, as you can see on the left, my floor plan, actually one of my students' floor plans of the ground floor. These arcades, via other corner tower chambers, allowed circumambulation of the main floor and access to the second floor rooms of the 4 corner towers, which were all originally plastered with wooden chair rails and baseboards. These were likely reserved to be bed chambers. Now, the Great Hall, and now you can see ground floor above, and ground floor below, second floor above. The Great Hall also opened directly into an adjacent fully paneled parlor, which in turn led to a small tower chamber with access to the roof. And from that tower, family and guests could circumnavigate the entire building via rooftop walkways that connected all 4 of the tower top chambers. Close physical examination of COLBECK Castle suggested an 18th century construction gate, sash windows, a grand double-height entrance stair hall, an upstairs entertaining room, fully paneled main rooms with chairboards and baseboards on plaster in the tower rooms. And the stars for the wainscoting and the exterior galleries are positioned at an 18th century height, not the taller wainscoting of the 17th century. In each of these instances, the physical evidence suggests that the building dates from the 18th century. The main house of COLBECK stands among 4 outbuildings, 4 corner outbuildings, as you see here. The southeast likely functions as a gatekeeper's or manager's lodge. The southwest flanker sits over a huge, well-secured vaulted chamber. Together, these buildings frame the more formal front of the building. The 2 northern buildings define the rear work yard. You can see the 2 northern buildings here. The kitchen to the northwest, which you see here, is an extraordinarily sophisticated building comprised of 3 distinct spaces and functions. The main block of the house was a kitchen and washroom. Each end of the rectangular chamber was dominated by large open cooking fireplaces. Physical evidence suggests that at least one of these was flanked by a bake oven. Both ends of the kitchen were also originally outfitted with stew stoves of 3 pots each with plastic hoods above to carry the humid smells over to the main chimney flues. There's also evidence for fitted dressers with wooden backsplashes along one wall and 3 stone-lined units for below-ground storage, possibly cold storage. With 2 cooking fireplaces, multiple bake ovens, 2 stew stoves, built-in dressers for food preparation and cold storage, this was a very sophisticated 18th century kitchen. And now, with the surface spaces of the kitchen and the wash house dominated the flanker, the portion that extended to the south, which you can see a little wing there on the south, was a series of polite spaces, an extension of the main house. Surprisingly, this wing was dominated by a sunken bath fed by rainwater from the roof, together with a plastered changing room, and a pair of privies flushed by the overflow from the bath. Fascinating. The bathroom is almost fully occupied by a stone-lined pool. The edges of the room have, you can see this bath chamber is right here, and this is the changing room. The edges of the room have 18-inch ledges that just allow a person to walk the perimeter of the pool. A set of steps descend into the pool from the southwest corner, just beyond the changing room. The presence of a cold bathing pool in mid-18th century Jamaica is not a little surprising. Cold bathing had been resurrected as a means towards healthfulness in the very late 17th century amongst London physicians. One of the early proponents of cold water bathing was John Floyer, who published on the subject in 2 treatises in 1697 and 1806. Cold water bathing, he argued, was a means of regaining an ancient natural vigor, strength, and hardiness. By the middle of the century, cold water bathing had become widely practiced for its healthfulness, especially here, and that is here in Britain, especially for infants and children. It was by then being offered as a remedy for all kinds of ailments, especially cancer. While members of the middle class attended public baths, and the lower classes visited local rivers or waterfalls, by the 1730s, many English elites were installing cold baths on their country estates, usually in small bathing pavilions. In the 1770s, Edward Long, the famous narrator of Jamaica in the 18th century, reported that elite Jamaican families bathed their children daily and then exposed them freely to the air. As a result, no part of the world can show more beautiful children. While such cold baths on private property are unknown in the colonial American mainland, the presence of such a bath in cold bath establishes even deeper connections between the elites of Jamaica and their counterparts in Britain. Although fronted by an elegant range of arches, the northeast flanker was originally divided by masonry walls into a series of 6 equally sized chambers, each lighted by a single window on the rear wall. These chambers opened onto a front loggia, mirroring the miniature the granite arches of the main house. Such barrack-style accommodations for enslaved domestics were common in mid-18th century Jamaica. But raised substantially to create the flat terrace, and this is a photograph of that same flanker outside that terrace, so you can see its height. Raised substantially to create the flat terrace, this quarter, like the southwest building, also stands over a substantial vaulted warehouse. So with the kitchen to one side of the rear yard with its attendant butchering and cleaning of animals, the quarters to the other side, the rear of the house clearly functioned very much as a workyard, regularly occupied and crisscrossed by enslaved laborers performing the daily tasks of maintaining the household. And finally, documentation of the larger landscape surfaced ruins of aqueducts, boiling houses, and mills, all suggesting that this spectacular house stood in the midst of an expansive and highly profitable 18th century sugar plantation. Now, together with dozens of students working over 2 different field seasons in 2006 and 2007, Ed Chappell and I have completely documented the extraordinary ruins of COLBECK. After documentation, 3 things were clear. The building was definitely a product of British production, not Spanish. The building was definitely mid to late 18th century, and the building was certainly completed and occupied. Now, naturally, after we'd begun our friendship, I shared my learnings with Robert, who knew about the site but had not given the building much thought. Our conversations piqued his interest, and he started naturally poking around. I turned my attention to the upcoming academic year, but Robert, unbeknownst to me, dug into 18th century newspapers. In early October, after that field season, he sent me a document that included 13 clippings from various newspapers from the final quarter of the 18th century that made clear that in those years, COLBECK on Jamaica was directly associated with a Scottish emigre to Jamaica named John MacLeod. The death of John MacLeod of COLBECK, misspelled there, an eminent planter on Jamaica in May 12, 1775, was reported in London's General Evening Post. Papers from 1783 suggested that sometime after John's death, his son, also named John, had returned to Scotland. 4 years later, John the Younger and his wife were returning from the Mediterranean, where she bore its second child, while sailing off the coast of Sicily, poor woman. And by 1796, John MacLeod the Younger had purchased a 16th century manor house called Ballinreef in East Lothian, outside of Edinburgh. Now, notices of John MacLeod the Younger into the 1790s continued to name him of COLBECKs in the island of Jamaica, suggesting that MacLeod the Younger preserved his colonial origins, even though he was fully resident in Scotland. And just because I couldn't help myself, here's the house that John the Younger purchased in East Lothian after to establish his household back in Scotland. In 1789, after MacLeod's death, the building described as COLBECK Castle was offered for sale to the government for use as a barracks for the accommodation of British troops. And in that ad, the castle is described as costing the proprietor £70,000 sterling. That same announcement suggests that the building might be obtained for half the price, suggesting some decline in MacLeod's interest in the property, or some decline in profitability of the plantation. That's a puzzle that Robert and I were never able to figure out. The MacLeod's continued ownership suggests that the sale did not resolve. Together, these clips from Robert made clear that COLBECK Castle had been built prior to 1775 by a Scottish emigre named John MacLeod, who built the house and lived in it as a centerpiece of a very profitable sugar plantation. This was an exciting discovery that confirmed most of my theories from our 2 seasons of field documentation. Now, a few years later, Robert was in conversation with Jackie Branston, who was then doing research in Spanish Town Archive, reinforcing the fact that he was the center of this web of researchers. Everybody knew Robert. Anybody that worked on Jamaica knew Robert, and we were all beholden to him. Now, in sort of brilliance, he asked her to search for John MacLeod's probate records following MacLeod's 1775 death. She found it and shared it with Robert, who shared it with me. His probate inventory offers an extraordinary accounting of the building's contents. Now, MacLeod's COLBECK plantation included 355 enslaved women and children, men, women, and children. Those living off the house terrace would have surely included individuals named as Dirty Pit Peggy, the cook, Mulatto Nancy, Black Nancy, Katie and Patty, washerwomen, and some or all of the 4 drivers. MacLeod owned 4 drivers: Mars, Lambridge, Jack, or Vigil. And probably also the housemaids, Prissy, Quadri, Nellie, and Little Betty. With the kitchen to one side of the rear yard, the attendant butchering and cleaning of animals, the quarters to the other side, the rear of the house functioned very much as a workyard, regularly occupied and crisscrossed by these various slaves, now named from his probate inventory. Now, this very large number of enslaved people, 355, suggests a large plantation, and suggests also that there are likely numerous enslaved village sites scattered across the still largely undeveloped landscape of the former plantation. Although I recently seen an aerial photograph which suggests that subdivisions are now going in, to my breaks my heart. But the storage of 134 hogsheads of sugar, together with the ruins of aqueducts, mills, and boiling houses, made clear that MacLeod was growing and processing sugar. But he was also running a substantial livestock operation. The inventory includes a large herd of 575 cattle. 575 cattle, inclusive of working steer, fattening cows, breeding cows, and bulls of various descriptions. In addition to a variety of horses, the plantation also included 12 sheep, 60 goats, and 121 hogs. And of course, in an entry that excited Robert to no end, and following the list of enslaved people and their livestock, the inventory includes also an extraordinary listing of silver, including all manners of forms valued at 465 pounds sterling. His household inventory was extraordinary, befitting the grandeur of the house. Numerous mahogany dining tables, breakfast and dressing tables, 6 large bedsteads with beds and matching windows and bed curtains, 10 paintings, 75 framed prints, his billiard table and organ chamber, together with his 6-horse chariot, signified his capacity for leisure, his cultured refinement, and his grand self-presentation. This penchant for display is reinforced by so many things. Saucepans, chocolate pots, and other specialty items listed in the kitchen betray the sophisticated culinary expectations of this family from the mid-18th century. But most of all, the extraordinary listings of goods housed in the, quote, stores, likely the vaulted chambers, which you see here, the 2 quarter buildings, reveal McLeod's capacity to purchase and store high volumes of English goods. So at the time of inventory, in addition to 140 gallons of rum, likely Jamaican distilled, he stored 772 bottles of wine, mostly claret, but also port, sherry, and bourbon ale. This, together with salted hams, local beef, barrels of split peas, raisins, currants, and oatmeal. He also stored building supplies, including 100 gallons of linseed oil, 70 gallons of tar, and some of the space, in a separate space, large lots of osnwork, which is a cloth likely used to clothe enslaved people. This inventory includes substantial quantities of blacksmiths, carpenters, and bricklayer tools, agreeing with the listing of enslaved men, including all construction trades in the inventory, including even a plumber. In a separate chamber, he stored a range of fine textiles, including chintz, damask, printed linen, yellow and blue livery cloth, but also red check for covering furniture in summer. John McLeod's house signaled an incredible degree of elite cultural currency, a monument of sophisticated British architecture erected at the very fringe of empire. Now, returning to the Island Record Office the next summer, I had the chance to search for evidence of John McLeod's purchase of this parcel. After some hours of digging, I finally came across McLeod's 1749 purchase of the parcel from Bernard Henry. And even by this point, 1749, McLeod is already described as an established planter in St. George's Parish. The deed maintains a remarkably large and mature plantation operation already established at the time of McLeod's purchase. The plantation and sugar works, commonly called and known by the name of COLBECK, situate lying in the parish of St. George's. Includes lemons, tenants, 169 enslaved laborers, as well as horses, mares, mules, and also cattle, sheep, and other stock plantations and implements for planting, all standing on 1,679 acres. This archival research proved enormously helpful in dating the house and adding some textures to McLeod's everyday life. Not insignificantly, McLeod named as his principal co-resident in his will a mulatto woman named Sally and his Negro slave named Tower Hill, both emancipated and the only people emancipated in his will. He gave to Sally 20 pounds of Jamaican money per annum and the right to live in the house as long as the mansion house remains unsold at the point of his death. If the house is to be sold, her annual increase to 50 pounds per annum. John McLeod COLBECK, an eminent planter, died as Robert had revealed for me on May 12, 1775, but he died at his great seat, which is, of course, McLeod Plantation. Now, 2 years later, it came time for me to draft a chapter that would include COLBECK Castle, so Robert and I returned our attention to this incredibly important site to further secure the construction date. We already knew that Robert was remarkably adept at mapping and cartography, so it's no surprise that he insisted that we begin there. Having clearly located the site of the ruin through Google Earth, in terms of its exact specifications, we began to investigate 18th century maps. The Sheffield maps of the island, printed in 1755 on the left, show no evidence of any settlement at the site, even a house or even a named landowner. This map also includes a symbol for gentlemen's seats in addition to houses, and so surely this pile would have been recorded recorded as one such seat, but the map is blank, where the house should stand. The Craftsman and Simpson map, recorded in the late 1750s and printed in 1763, which you see on the right, likewise shows no occupation of the site. But, as already mentioned, McLeod was reported as dying at his seat in 1775, suggesting that the house was built by that point. Yet the exact site of the building is identified as a square house and labeled COLBECK on Archibald Campbell's 1782 survey of the south coast of Jamaica, suggesting that the house was certainly completed by that date. The absence of any mention of a mansion house in the purchase of the will of 1749, nor any reference to the house on either of the 1750s or the 1760s maps, strongly suggests the construction of the house post-dates 1760. Given the extensive listing in his inventory, the alignment of the house contents with the surviving architecture of the house ruins, and the use of the terms mansion house and house seat in the final probate documents, we can assume that the house was standing at the time of the drafting of his will in 1775. Working together, Robert and I had narrowed the construction windows between 1760 and 1775, confirming my original theories developed during our archaeological fieldwork. One very tantalizing bit of information, and I find this fascinating, is that in 1762, John McLeod of COLBECK in Jamaica applied for arms to be recognized as the chief of a branch of the McLeod clan in Scotland. While this is hardly definitive evidence, the application for arms might well align with the construction or completion of the Great House, both remarkably important symbols and signals of one's elite status. Now, worth mentioning are two early 19th century accounts of COLBECK plantation, both of which reinforce the fact that sugar plantation, the fact of sugar production, and the presence of the mansion house. The John Carter Brown Library holds the diary of Jamaican surveyor William Fraser, who was resident at COLBECK as a guest in 1801. 2 decades later, the Journal of an Unnamed Traveler, now in the National Library of Scotland, records a several-month stay at COLBECK where he documented the planting business. On January 8th, this unnamed traveler, January 8th of 1824, this unnamed traveler arrived at COLBECK, and his first mention is that of the overseer, Mr. Spencer, who he describes as a good sort of fellow. He reported to Spencer his intent to learn every information as to the culture of cane and the process of making sugar. In February of that same year, he notes a large dinner party of gentlemen at the house, gentlemen largely from Aberdeen and Bath, suggesting that COLBECK remained a center of Scottish interest on the island for both local planters and traveling and visiting Scots. In conclusion, I'll offer two contexts for understanding John McLeod's COLBECK Castle. The first is as the most prominent house erected by the many Scottish emigrant planters to the island. The majority of these houses were built on the north and the west coasts, and they all appear to date from the mid-18th to the early 19th century by planters who had recently emigrated from Scotland. Scottish family and place names abound: Stewart, Ainsley, Stirling, Ockendam, Edinburgh, Hutchinson. Now, historian Alan Harris has examined in detail the community he refers to as the Scottish sojourners to Jamaica. He describes these men as second and third tier sons of middling and educated Scottish families who traveled to Jamaica with specific intent of making a livable fortune and returning back to Scotland. This was the dream realized by John McLeod's son, but a hope that few others actually realized. Harris notes that the emigration of Scottish sojourners to Jamaica began in earnest in the 1740s and escalated through the 18th century. As a result of the lateness of their arrival relative to their English counterparts, the majority of these Scots planters purchased land in the frontier regions of the north and the west coasts of Jamaica, principally Westmoreland, Hanover, St. James, Trelawney, and St. Anne's parishes. By the end of the 18th century, these parishes had a 25% or more Scottish landowning population. As a result of this density, Harris argues there emerged mutually reinforcing webs of relationships among all of these Scots professionals and planters. These networks worked both as networks of support, but also worked to reinforce kinship networks and to distinguish Scots on Jamaica from their English counterparts, at least through the second half of the 18th century. Now, the houses erected in Jamaica by these Scots sojourners are surprising. You see some of them here. By the second half of the 18th century, the majority of middling educated Scottish families were building for themselves in Scotland single or double-piled Georgian houses with symmetrical front elevations and plans with central passages and flanked by well-lit chambers. Now, in short, the houses of most middling Scots were not fundamentally differentiated from their English counterparts. Yet the houses erected by these Scottish sojourners along the more remote and violent north and west coasts of Jamaica drew upon an older, more defensive architectural tradition long inscribed in the Scottish landscape. Unlike MacLeod, most of Jamaica's Scottish sojourners chose not to build for themselves genteel Georgian country houses, such as those of their emigres would have been in Scotland. In building tower houses in Jamaica, most Scottish builders drew upon this older tradition of defensive architecture from their homelands. Examples include Stuart's Castle by John Stuart I. You can see Stuart's Castle ranging across the top in ruins condition. Built by John Stuart I as a tower house, a substantial house with a single roof or floor. There's also Edinburgh Castle, which you see in the middle, the floor plan on the right there, and also a building it's called Q Park, which I think is just spectacular. This double towered building on the left, also built by Scots on the north coast of Jamaica. Now, looking specifically at Stuart's Castle, you can see the building on the left, built by James Stuart I, and then his son, Stuart II, on the right-hand side, clearly amplifying. And what I've done here in this particular map shows the view shed from the loopholes or firing windows from which one can fire armaments out onto an invading group of people, very likely the Maroons or enslaved people engaged in insurrection. This is John Stuart II's house. The expansion by his son is even further fortified the site. Other such capital examples along the north coast include Stuart's Fort, Edinburgh Castle, and Kew Park. In these choices, in all these cases, the choice to reject fashionable options in favor of defense was a clear reflection of Scottish anxieties about personal safety in Jamaica's extraordinarily hostile environment. And the concentrated appearance of these houses in the 1760s is also not a surprise. This is the same decade the greatest number of Jamaica's slave rebellions. Hoping to reside but a while, these planters erected houses like those that had defended personal land holdings in the violent border districts of Scotland for centuries. But settling on the south coast and purchasing for himself an already established sugar plantation and cattle farm, John MacLeod more closely approximated his English counterparts on Jamaica. And here is the second context. If the construction of this house was a bid to step into the ranks of the island's English ruling elite, it failed. Already by the 1750s, the Longs, the Prices, the Blagroves, and others had been wealthy planters on the island for 2 generations or more. MacLeod's bid to erect a large and sophisticated house as a possible means of rising into these ranks was ultimately unsuccessful. John MacLeod was never elected to the Assembly, nor appears to have been elected to any major public office, save the vestry of his local parish. And most tellingly, neither John MacLeod nor his great castle is mentioned in Edward Monk's comprehensive 3-volume history of the island, written just a few years after MacLeod completed this spectacular house pile. While Long discusses the decoy and other plantations built by the English in some great detail, the newly finished COLBECK Castle was excised from William Long's account of the island. Soon after the construction of the house, MacLeod sent his sons to Britain for their education, and he expected them to stay. His will directed that upon his death, his great house at COLBECK Plantation was to be sold. The island's elite were those from the English families with a long history on the island, not newly arrived Scots, no matter how wealthy or sophisticated. So here ends our remarkable story of the great house of Colbeck Castle, an astonishing house built in the 1760s by a Scottish immigrant on the formulas of an Italian Renaissance villa, sitting at the heart of an enormously profitable 1,600-acre sugar plantation and cattle farm. The grandeur of this house was signaled by his extensive household inventory, including Robert Barker's favorite, that extensive listing of silver. His on-site and off-site, not Barker's, but McLeod's, on-site and off-site storehouses reveal also McLeod's astonishing import and export business, and his will reveals his sexual preference for Sally, his mulatto mistress. McLeod intended for his sons to be educated in England, and depending on the wealth of his Jamaican holdings, his son John McLeod purchased a 16th century manor house just outside of Edinburgh, an ultimate sign of a successful sojourn. And here ends my story of the project of researching Colbeck Castle, a project that could not have been made possible without the indefatigable research prowess of my dear friend,
Lewis, it came as no surprise to me whatsoever that that was completely written. So thank you very, very much. Just such a fascinating story. I have no doubt that there will be quite a few questions, either now or later when we sit as a panel at the end. Any questions from the floor, please? Tessa. Oh, now hang on, we have to give you the microphone for the online people who are here.
Are there any clues to the identity of the architect used for Colbeck? And might it possibly be somebody who was trained as a military engineer? So it's a very rich nursery for secular architects in the 18th century.
So there was no documentary evidence that gives us a shred of a guess to the designer of this building, but you rightly point out that some of the most robust engineers on the island in the late 17th and early 18th century, who later in their career might very well have designed this, are going to be especially naval engineers. And so the presence of the British Navy and engineers who are associated with the building up of the military footprint across Jamaica, in fact across the West Indies, are a ready source of designers. Whether a military officer would have had a penchant for Italian Renaissance villas is not entirely clear to me, but I would love to be able to have the opportunity to dive more further into that. Sadly, we found no evidence.
What I was struck by was that the photographs almost looked like a negative, a photographic negative, insofar as in English architecture of that period, you would expect the walls to be built of brick and the coins to be of stone, and it's the other way around. Does that reflect availability of materials or what?
Absolutely. You have so much strong buildable rubble stone in Jamaica, it just makes a ton of sense to build your principal masonry buildings out of stone. So yeah, you're going to regularly see stone construction with brick, coin, and trim. That's just really common for availability of materials.
Any other questions?
Can I just ask why? Can I just ask why the centre castle part is slightly skewed to the other four corners?
It's a great question that's been haunting me for a while. I almost didn't show the plan because I don't have a great answer for that. But the fact that the central house does not perfectly align with the corner buildings suggests to me two phases of design and construction. That in fact the house was begun, and for a season I had a theory that the house was actually begun without the arcades, and the arcades were added later, but I'm wrong on that. And so I do believe that there are two moments of design and construction. The terracing being part of the latter, and then if the main house is begun, it obviously can't be moved. And then the topography lending itself to a terrace that is not aligned. So I think that that is the most logical explanation for, but very observant for you to think that out.
This is from L. Pesnick, who wants to know, does McLeod's inventory give any indication as to the sources of his silver?
Sadly, no. The inventory only lists the objects themselves and their valuation. Now, one might suggest that a comprehensive analysis of probate inventories across 18th century Jamaica might be able to provide some sense of the range of production, and that may speak to English versus Jamaican manufacture. Yeah. So a more comprehensive statistical view across all the probate inventories might begin to suggest some differentiation between British and or Jamaican manufacture for their valuation. But that's not going to give us any indications of makers or sort of aesthetic choices. Sadly.
Thanks so much. Just pursuing that question on the silver inventory. You said that Robert was so excited, understandably, when you found that. Did he do any further investigations on that inventory post the finding of it, and did you discuss it in any way?
So our discussions hovered largely around the richness of this particular inventory relative to many other inventories that he had seen. He was no stranger to 18th century archival research. And so he had seen many inventories and appropriate accounts. He had just not seen this one previously. And so the conversation largely hovered around the richness of this particular listing. I don't remember him commenting on any particular forms that were noted in this inventory that were not found elsewhere, which I think is probably at the core of your question. And so sadly, I don't remember him commenting on anything in that vein.
Did Clive actually get a grant for this? You said he applied.
Yes, he did.
So we might be allowed pieces it would be regular without arms at that.
That's correct. That is correct. I have not hunted that down. I will leave that for the next generation. So
Any other questions? James.
Thank you. Is there any evidence in the physical evidence in the building where silver might have been stored, strong room or bleak room?
yeah, that's a really great question. There is not. It's not clear evidence because I don't have the fittings to determine which door would be more strong and lockable. I would assume it would be one of the tower rooms. That would be the storeroom for valuables, which is pretty common. That would be, as I look at the floor plan, that would be a common space. All of the windows were exactly the same size, and I could not determine any differentiation of a strong door into one of those. And all of them have two doors of access, amplifying the circumambulation around the building, which would also, you want a strong room only to have a single door. So the building doesn't give us that key.
Just a very quick question. Have you plans to publish that inventory in its entirety? Because it sounds as if it deserves that.
Well, it sounds like maybe this particular conference is leading towards some kind of a publication, so that might be inappropriate. Especially since it's such a wonderful document that Robert and I have been working for so long.
Very well mined. Very well mined. Yes.
Yeah, right.
That's a wonderful talk. You were talking about the Scottish building, the defensive building, but also Stuart Castle was very much of that ilk. This doesn't look like a defensible structure at all. No gun rooms, nothing. So presumably you felt fairly safe and secure.
I think that's right. Well, so two things to keep in mind. One, the little circular windows on the ground floor sort of pay homage to the notion of defensible architecture, but there's no cannon that's sitting in that, that's livery storage and things like that. And so there's a gesture towards the sort of symbolic of the defensible, but not, if you compare that to what we've documented on the North Coast, it's completely different. You know, proper loopholes motivated by the intent of defense. The major difference, of course, is this is on the South Coast. And the South Coast was much more secure, much more widely populated, and insurrections, enslavement insurrections are happening much more frequently on the North Coast and on the West. And so there's just a significant differentiation of the necessity of architecture of the two different locales.
One thought. Sorry, just one question. No basement?
No basement. Although a very, well, I should say, a very sophisticated water drainage system. So there are a ton of water capture with cisterns. And then the basements below the two corner flankers, both of which were vaulted secure rooms for the enormous volumes of his import and export goods. Which is really sort of remarkable because it's not near a river. So all of that is coming in and going out. This is a storehouse with huge volumes of content. They're just going in by wagon, which is, from Virginia, you expect everything to move by water. Okay.
Just maybe, is there evidence of his, you've got his storehouses, but is there evidence of his trading activities in archives or anything?
No, we actually didn't get that far. An expansion of this project really would look into mercantile activities. We have a pretty good sense through the probate records of the expanse of his cattle farming and his sugar plantation. Before we would publish anything on this, we want to know all more about his mercantile activities.
I noticed the most famous, certainly amongst an audience interested in silver, the most famous slave-owning plantation owner amongst the English community was, of course, William Beck, although he didn't live there. But I did notice on the 1673 map a place not far from Colbeck Castle called Beck. Were the Beckford estates near there?
Absolutely. Yes. So many, where he is building this house is situated right in the midst of a lot of the English elite, which is all the more reason why it's remarkable that he is kind of excised from that community. Right? He's building right in the middle of it, yet they ignore him every time. Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think we're going to, it's absolutely on the button, on schedule. We're going to stop now for lunch. So, Lewis, thank you very, very much.